What does it mean to be the perfect person? Perfect in body? Perfect in mind? The ideal character? The strongest? The most talented? The most driven? The reality of human perfection is one many have tried to realize, racially, genetically, through education, training, discipline, and control. Self-improvement is in our nature, but attempts at perfection invariably lead to dark places. The most horrifying single example is the brief, bizarre life of Hildegard Rodriguez Carballeira. To the outside world, she was one of the most remarkable people to ever live, a young woman with seemingly superhuman intellect. She was fluent in 8 languages by the age of 10. By 11, she was giving public lectures to sold-out crowds. But no one knew the awful story of how she became a child genius. Only her shocking death at the age of 18 would reveal the secret torment of Hildegard Carballeira, better known to history as the Red Virgin. The story begins in 1879 in the town of Ferrol in Spain. Aurora Carballeira was born into a prominent, affluent family. From an early age, she was intellectually curious. She spent hours and hours reading, educating herself on many subjects. Through her private study, she grew into a socialist, feminist, and atheist. She also became convinced of the importance of education, how self-improvement can be achieved by mental discipline. But Aurora was also seduced by a very dangerous idea: eugenics, the concept that humanity can be perfected through genetic manipulation. In the 21st century, the idea that certain people shouldn't be allowed to procreate is rightly seen as creepy. The idea of specially selecting for desirable genes in order to create superchildren, that's also pretty out there. But in Aurora's day, the late 19th century, such notions were fashionable. Many believed this new reproductive science could eliminate all undesirable human traits. It was a kind of genetic determinism, a belief that someone's whole life was written in their DNA. In the future, society would be stronger, smarter, and free of social ills. These ideas would have a profound effect on the mind of Aurora Carballeira and send her down an increasingly twisted path. In 1896, when Aurora was 16, her sister Josefa had a son named Pepito. The boy was conceived and born out of wedlock with an unknown father. Josefa left him in Aurora's care, then ran away to Madrid to live her life. The teenage Aurora suddenly had a golden opportunity to test her ideas about education and human perfection. She taught the infant Pepito to play the piano, forcing him to practice for hours a day, determined to turn him into a child prodigy. Astoundingly, she succeeded. By the age of 2.5, Pepito was a master pianist. Despite the fact he couldn't read music, or written words for that matter, the toddler could perfectly play back any song that he heard. He was composing music before the age of 3. Pepito's musical genius didn't go unnoticed. When his mother heard him play piano, she reclaimed him and brought him with her to Madrid. At the age of 3, he performed 6 of his original songs for the King and Queen of Spain. All this raises an interesting question. Did Aurora's training make Pepito a child prodigy, or was he just a natural-born musical genius like Mozart? Whatever the case, Aurora definitely believed that she had made Pepito what he was by forcing him to take piano lessons as an infant. Whether or not that was true, in her mind it confirmed the view that human beings can and must be molded into the ultimate versions of themselves. Losing control of Pepito enraged Aurora. She lashed out at her family, accusing them of exploiting the child. Her sister got to reap the benefits of the boy's talent. Given all this, it's not hard to understand the direction Aurora's life ultimately took. She resolved to devote her life to a grand human experiment, one that would test the theory of eugenics, prove her ideas about child rearing, and create a new model for the whole human race to follow. She would create the perfect child, a paragon of good breeding and strict discipline. After all, she'd done it once with Pepito. She could do it again. But in order to conduct this experiment, Aurora would need a baby of her own. This was a problem for several reasons. Firstly, Aurora had zero interest in forming a relationship with a man, let alone marrying one. She found physical intimacy disgusting. In her view, traditional relationships trapped women and deprived them of their freedom, so falling in love was out of the question. Another problem was genetics. Aurora wasn't taking any chances with her biological project. What she needed to do was find the man with the best possible traits, hold her nose, and seduce him. But the biggest problem was possession. Aurora needed to have complete control over the child. The experience of losing Pepito could never be repeated, so she needed to find the perfect genetic mate, but he also had to be someone who would never claim paternity and remove the child from her home. Eventually, Aurora found a solution to all these problems and managed to work up the nerve to become intimate with a man. The man she chose was Alberto Paes Montseny. Alberto was educated, academically brilliant, and he came from a socially acceptable background. But for Aurora, the best thing about him was that he was a priest. That meant there was zero chance of him asking to marry her, and since he'd taken a vow of celibacy, Alberto could never claim the child as his own. Aurora had 3 encounters with Alberto, who she referred to not as her lover but as her physiological collaborator. Once she became pregnant, she ghosted him and ran away to Madrid. Aurora's experiment began the moment she knew she was pregnant. Throughout the following 9 months, she adhered to a strict routine, bathing twice daily and waking every hour in the night so she could roll over to ensure even blood flow to the fetus. On December 9, 1914, Aurora gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named the child Hildegard. Aurora must have been relieved the child was female. As you might have guessed, her ideas about eugenics and education were all tangled up with her desire to advance the state of women. As she later remarked, she wanted Hildegard to be the most perfect woman who was the measure of humanity and the final redeemer. As with Pepito, the training began immediately. Aurora dominated her daughter's life, never leaving her alone or in the care of others. Throughout her childhood, Hildegard had almost no contact with other adults, and wasn't allowed to make friends her own age either. Aurora was proud of the stifling, isolated environment she created for her daughter. She told the young Hildegard that the pair of them were on a mission. Love, human connection, joy, these things didn't matter, only achieving their goal. Hildegard's achievements were extraordinary. At 11 months, Hildegard knew the alphabet. By 22 months, she was reading. Age 2, she could produce legible handwriting. As a 3-year-old, she was able to write and send letters. She was typing and playing piano by age 4. Hildegard's first language was naturally Spanish. By 10, she was also fluent in English, Portuguese, German, Italian, French, and Latin. This brilliant young woman was drilled ceaselessly by her mother, and prevented from pursuing anything that might distract from their mission. Although Aurora and Hildegard were inseparable, there was very little affection in their relationship. Reportedly, the two never even hugged. Aurora did, however, teach her daughter about the birds and the bees, which was very rare in Spain at that time. Hildegard's feelings about reproduction would play a big part in her rise to fame, and her tragic death. Hildegard absorbed her mother's political and social ideas. She came to believe that the biggest problem facing Spain was reproductive rights, or lack thereof. At the age of 11, she delivered public lectures on this subject that brought out huge crowds. Hildegard called the lack of contraception in Spain a terrible epidemic that resulted in huge, impoverished families and massive social problems. She declared that women would never be free until they could have affairs without the fear of getting pregnant, as men did. Again, she was 11 when she made these arguments, in public, in front of sold-out crowds. These ideas were radical at the time, but because Hildegard was a child, she was able to get away with saying things a grown woman wouldn't have been able to. Aurora had mixed feelings about all this. On the one hand, her experiment was clearly a success. Her daughter was a prodigy, a public intellectual at the age of 11. On the other hand, as Hildegard became famous, she began to step out of her mother's shadow. Aurora could feel her power beginning to slip away. Hildegard entered law school in 1928, at the age of 13. Within 4 years, she would be teaching classes there. While she was studying for her degree, Hildegard also found time to write 2 books about reproductive rights. They sold well and helped bring her to international attention. She had a correspondence with Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, who was stunned by the teenage girl leading the fight for family planning in Spain. She also became friends with Havelock Ellis, an expert on human intimacy. Ellis was somewhat obsessed with Hildegard, describing her as "my Spanish lawyer girl" and "one of the wonders of the world." He wrote a profile of Hildegard's life and upbringing. It was Ellis who nicknamed her the Red Virgin because of her socialism and her contraceptive campaign. Ellis was also a proponent of eugenics. He was fascinated by Aurora and spoke glowingly of her parenting, describing her as the new mother of today, strong and youthful in spirit. The respect was not mutual. As Hildegard's fame grew, Aurora grew more and more paranoid, more desperate to keep her daughter under her wing. Her famous foreign friends were a threat. Hildegard was making more attempts to break free from her mother. She left the socialists and published articles critical of Aurora's politics. Aurora always accompanied her daughter on speaking engagements and forced her to dress all in black to avoid male attention, but that was becoming impossible. Hildegard was forming her own ideas and identity. She had suitors and celebrity admirers. The experiment was taking on a life of its own. The beginning of the end was when Hildegard met the famous author H.G. Wells, who is best known for writing War of the Worlds. Hildegard had corresponded with Wells and accompanied him when he paid a visit to Spain. Wells was disturbed by Aurora's controlling behavior. He offered Hildegard a job as his secretary, promising her a new life in London away from her mother. Hildegard politely refused. That decision sealed her fate. Aurora was already a paranoid control freak, but a horrifying discovery she made around this time caused her to get even worse. It turned out that Alberto Paes Monsini, Hildegard's father, had been convicted of assaulting his own niece. He hadn't been the ideal donor after all. The whole experiment was tainted, and it was getting out of her control. In May of 1933, Aurora locked Hildegard in their house and cut the phone lines. Her paranoia had grown into full-blown delusion. She was convinced that Ellis and Wells were British spies sent to kidnap her daughter and destroy her life's work. It couldn't be allowed. On June 9, 1933, Aurora calmly walked into a police station and confessed what she'd done. The police rushed to her home where they found Hildegard's lifeless body in her bed, with 4 bullet wounds in the head and chest. She was 18 years old. Aurora was arrested and put on trial in 1934. Ultimately, she was sentenced to 26 years in prison. When asked why she had ended the life of her brilliant daughter, Aurora replied, "The sculptor, after discovering the most minimal imperfection in his work, destroys it." Hildegard was never more than an experiment to her, and in her mind, she had the right to terminate that experiment any time she wanted. She was unapologetic about her crime to the end of her days, insisting she would do it again. Aurora died of cancer in a psychiatric ward in 1955. The legend of Hildegard Carballeira has lived on. She will always be remembered for her stunning intellect and the brilliant future that was stolen from her. A cautionary tale about the pursuit of perfection and the denial of free will. If you enjoyed this video, leave us a like and a comment, and subscribe to History Snob for more tales from the past. Thanks for watching.